Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Whispers. Tonight, we're leaving behind quiet neighborhoods and safe highways to face a stretch of road that's as dangerous as it is legendary. The Tale of the Dragon. Tucked deep within the North Carolina mountains, this twisting, treacherous highway is feared by many and respected by all who dare to drive it. For truckers, the Tale of the Dragon is more than a road. It's a gauntlet. With 318 sharp curves in just 11 miles, every bend feels like it could be your last. But some who drive it swear that the real danger isn't just the pavement. Strange figures are said to emerge from the tree line. Phantom headlights follow in the mirrors, and whispers ride the mountain wind as if the forest itself is alive. The 10 stories you're about to hear come from truckers who braved this serpentine highway and encountered things they can't explain. These are their nightmares, where asphalt, shadows, and fear blur together, leaving behind scars that last long after the drive is over. If you're new to Horror Whispers, subscribe for nightly journeys into the haunted, the strange, and the unexplainable. Hit the notification bell so you'll never miss a tale whispered from the dark. So dim the lights, grip the wheel tight, and prepare yourself. Tonight we're diving into 10 true trucker nightmares from North Carolina's Tale of the Dragon. My name is Henry Collins, and I've been driving a big rig for the better part of 30 years. I've seen it all, or so I thought. I've driven through blizzards in the Rockies that turned the world into a wall of white, navigated floods in the Midwest that turned highways into rivers, and hauled loads through desert heat that could cook an egg on the dashboard. I'm not a man who spooks easily. But what I saw on the Tale of the Dragon one October night, that wasn't weather, and it wasn't road fatigue. It was something else. The run was a simple one. A load of machine parts from Knoxville to a small factory in Robbinsville. It was my last haul of the week, and my mind was already on a hot meal in my own bed. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the sky a deep, starless black. The only light came from my own headlights, carving a tunnel through the dense, dark woods of the Great Smoky Mountains. The dragon is a beast even in broad daylight. A relentless series of 318 tight, unforgiving curves packed into just 11 miles. At night, it's a different animal entirely. It's claustrophobic. The trees press in on you, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for your cab. I was about 2 miles in, my hands tight on the wheel, my focus absolute. You don't daydream on the dragon. You don't get distracted, you just drive. The air was cold and still, the kind of silence that's so deep it has a sound of its own, a low humming pressure in your ears. That's when I saw them. 2 small bright pinpricks of light in my driver's side mirror. They were far back, maybe half a mile, but they were there. I didn't think much of it at first. It was late, but not unheard of for a car to be on this road. Probably some kid in a sports car thinking he's a race driver. I kept my speed steady, downshifting for a particularly nasty hairpin turn. When I straightened out, I glanced in the mirror again. The lights were closer, much closer. They had closed the distance with a speed that just wasn't possible on these curves, not without going over the edge. A prickle of annoyance went through me. Some idiot was tailgating me on one of the most dangerous roads in the country. I tapped my brakes, just a quick flash of red to let him know he was too close. The lights didn't back off. If anything, they seemed to surge forward, growing larger and brighter in my mirror until they filled the entire frame, blinding me with their intensity. My heart started to pound, a heavy, frantic drum against my ribs. This wasn't normal. The lights were so bright they hurt my eyes, a pure, piercing white with no discernible vehicle around them. It was just light, hot, aggressive light. I couldn't see a grill or a bumper or the shape of a car. It was like 2 miniature suns were glued to my trailer. I could feel the heat of them, or maybe I was just imagining it, a phantom warmth on the back of my neck. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. I was navigating a sharp right-hander, the tires of my rig groaning in protest. The lights stayed right there, perfectly centered behind me, as if they weren't bound by the same laws of physics I was. Panic started to set in, cold and sharp. I've had close calls before, but this was different. This felt predatory. It felt like I was being hunted. I sped up a little, pushing my rig faster than I was comfortable with. The lights matched my speed instantly. I slowed down. They slowed down. They were toying with me. The road ahead was a blur of twisting asphalt and dark trees. My focus was split between the deadly curves in front of me and the terrifying, impossible lights behind me. Finally, I had enough. Coming out of a turn onto a short, relatively straight stretch, no more than 100 yards, I slammed on my brakes. It was a stupid, reckless move. My trailer fishtailed, the smell of burning rubber filling the cab. I braced for the impact, for the sound of metal crunching metal, for the shattering of glass. But there was nothing, just the screech of my own tires, and then silence. The blinding lights were gone. I sat there for a moment, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my whole body trembling. I looked in my rearview mirror. Nothing. I looked in the passenger side mirror. Nothing. Just the dark, empty road and the black, silent trees. Slowly, I pulled my rig over to the narrow shoulder, the engine rumbling in the quiet. I killed the engine, and the world went completely still. I got out of the cab, my legs feeling weak and unsteady. The air was cold, biting at my exposed skin. I walked to the back of my trailer, my boots crunching on the gravel. There was no car, there was no wreckage. There were no skid marks other than my own. I looked over the edge of the road down the steep, wooded embankment. There was no sign that another vehicle had ever been there. It had simply vanished. I stood there for what felt like an hour. The silence of the forest pressing in on me, more unnerving than any noise. I wasn't tired anymore. The adrenaline had burned away every trace of exhaustion, leaving behind a raw, gnawing fear. I got back in my truck, locked the doors, and drove the rest of the way through the Dragon without once looking in my rearview mirror. I didn't want to know if the lights would come back. To this day, I don't know what was behind me that night. A ghost? A warning? Some kind of local phenomenon? All I know is that it wasn't human, and it wanted me to know I was on its road. I've taken the long way around ever since. Some roads just aren't worth the toll. My name is Steve Randall. I've been a long-haul trucker for about 15 years. You learn a lot on the road. You learn to read the weather, you learn to read other drivers, and you learn to trust your gut. My gut has saved me from a jackknife on black ice outside of Cheyenne and from a load shift that would have put me in a ditch in Arkansas. But one rainy night on the tail of the Dragon, I went against my gut, and I've been paying for it ever since. It was a miserable night. The kind of rain that doesn't just fall, it attacks. It came down in solid sheets, so thick that my wipers on full blast could barely keep up. The road was slick and treacherous, and the fog was starting to roll in, clinging to the asphalt like a shroud. Driving the Dragon in perfect conditions is a test of skill. Driving it in a storm like this is a test of sanity. I was maybe halfway through, my whole body tense, when my headlights caught something on the side of the road. It was a person. A lone figure standing by the guardrail, completely soaked. As I got closer, I could see it was a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 20. She had long, dark hair plastered to her face and was wearing a simple white dress that was now translucent and clinging to her thin frame. She wasn't trying to flag me down. She was just standing there, staring out into the darkness. Every instinct I had screamed at me to keep going. You don't pick up hitchhikers, not ever. Especially not on a deserted road in the middle of a storm. It's the first rule of survival out here. But she looked so lost, so vulnerable. The rain was coming down harder, and a flash of lightning lit up the sky, showing her pale face and wide, empty eyes. Against my better judgment, my foot moved to the brake. I told myself I was just a decent guy. I couldn't leave her out here to die of exposure. I pulled the rig to a stop, the air brakes hissing in the rain. I leaned over and pushed open the passenger door. "You need a ride?" I yelled over the storm. "It's no night to be out here." She turned her head slowly, as if moving through water. She didn't say anything, just looked at me. Then she walked towards the truck and climbed into the cab. She moved with a strange, deliberate grace, not shivering from the cold as you'd expect. She pulled the heavy door shut, and the roar of the storm was suddenly muffled. She sat in the passenger seat, dripping water all over the floor, her hands folded in her lap. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to sound friendly, trying to ignore the cold dread that was starting to pool in my stomach. She finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper, soft and airy. "Just past the end of the road," she said, pointing a slender finger forward. "There's a white house with a red door. Just there." I nodded, putting the truck in gear. "All right then, let's get you home." The cab was silent for the next few miles. The only sounds were the rhythmic slap of the wipers, the rumble of the engine, and the constant drumming of the rain. I tried to make small talk. "What were you doing out there all by yourself?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just stared straight ahead, out the windshield, her eyes fixed on the winding road. The chill in the cab had nothing to do with the weather. It was coming from her. The air around her felt heavy and cold, and the faint scent of damp earth and something sweet like wilting flowers filled the space between us. I was starting to get seriously spooked. My gut was no longer screaming. It was in a full-blown panic. I just wanted her out of my truck. I focused on driving, counting down the miles until the dragon spat us out. Finally, I saw the sign that marked the end of the 11-mile stretch. The road straightened out, and just like she'd said, about a quarter-mile down, there was a small white farmhouse with a bright red door. A single light was on in a downstairs window. "There it is," I said, a wave of relief washing over me. "That the place?" She didn't respond. "Miss," I said, turning to look at her, "we're here." The passenger seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. She was gone. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't felt the shift in the truck's weight. She had just vanished. I frantically looked around the cab under the seat as if she could be hiding. The passenger door was still locked from the inside, just as it had been when she closed it. The seat was wet where she had been sitting, a dark, human-shaped stain on the fabric. A small puddle of water was on the floor mat. But she was gone. I sat there in the middle of the road, the engine idling, my mind refusing to process what had just happened. I stared at the white house with the red door. The light in the window was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold terror I felt. After a few minutes, I got the truck moving again, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. The next day, I stopped at a diner in Robbinsville. I had to know. I described the girl in the house to the old woman behind the counter. Her face went pale. She told me the story. 30 years ago, a young woman who lived in that house had a fight with her fiancé. She ran out into a stormy night, wearing her white prom dress. She was trying to walk to town. A drunk driver hit her and killed her right on the Dragon, not far from where I'd picked her up. They said she died instantly. The old woman looked at me with sad, knowing eyes. "You're not the first, you know," she said softly. "Every few years, on the anniversary of her death, a trucker will stop in here, white as a sheet, telling the same story. They say she's just trying to get home. I left that diner and never looked back. But sometimes, when I'm driving at night and the rain starts to fall, I'll glance over at the passenger seat. It's always empty. But the seat cushion still looks a little darker than the rest, and I can almost smell the faint scent of rain and flowers. And I remember the girl in the white dress forever trying to finish her last journey home. My name is Brenda McAllister. I'm what they call a road veteran, 40 years behind the wheel from coast to coast. I'm a no-nonsense woman. I believe in what I can see and touch. The rumble of my diesel engine, the weight of my load, the solid feel of the road beneath my tires. I don't believe in ghosts or goblins or things that go bump in the night. At least I didn't. One trip through the tail of the dragon changed all that. It was late autumn, and the mountains were being swallowed by a fog so thick it felt like you could grab a handful of it. I'd driven in fog before, but this was different. This was a living, breathing thing. It moved in silent, swirling currents, pressing against my windshield, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet. My world had shrunk to the small bubble of space illuminated by my headlights. The road, the trees, the sky, it was all gone, replaced by a uniform, suffocating gray. I was crawling along at a snail's pace, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my eyes straining to pick out the yellow line that was my only guide. The silence was absolute. The fog seemed to swallow every sound. Even the roar of my own engine was muffled, distant. It was like driving at the bottom of the ocean. The isolation was profound. I felt utterly and completely alone, a tiny speck of existence in a vast, empty void. I had my radio on, tuned to a classic rock station, more for the illusion of company than for the music. It was playing an old one, Creedence song. When it started to crackle, the music faded in and out, drowned by bursts of static. I figured I was just losing the signal, deep in the mountains as I was. I reached over to turn it off, but as my fingers touched the knob, the static cleared. For a second, there was perfect silence, and then a voice came through the speakers. It wasn't a DJ, it wasn't a singer, it was a whisper. A child's whisper, soft and clear, as if someone was leaning right next to my ear. "Help me," it said. I froze, my hand hovering over the radio. My heart hammered against my ribs. I told myself it was just interference, some stray signal from a CB radio, but the voice was so clear, so close. "I'm scared," the whisper came again, a little tremor in the voice, the sound of a child on the verge of tears. "It's so dark." This was impossible. I was in the middle of nowhere. There were no houses, no towns for miles. I scanned the impenetrable wall of fog outside my windows, looking for... What? A lost child? It was absurd. But the voice was so real, it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The radio, the passenger seat, the sleeper cab behind me. "Please," the whisper pleaded, closer now, more urgent. "Don't go." Stop. My logical mind was at war with the primal fear that was gripping me. "It's the fog," I told myself. "It's playing tricks on your mind. You're tired, you're stressed." But the voice, the sheer terror in that tiny, whispered voice felt more real than the truck I was driving. It was a raw, desperate plea that bypassed my brain and went straight to my soul. Against all reason, against every ounce of my common sense, I listened. My foot eased off the accelerator. The whisper grew more insistent, a frantic, eerie sound in my ear. "Stop! Stop now!" I slammed on the brakes. The big rig shuddered to a halt, the air brakes hissing angrily into the fog. The sudden stop threw me forward against my seatbelt. For a moment, everything was still. The engine idled, the wipers swished, and the whispers were gone. The radio was silent, and then, as if on cue, a sudden breeze cut through the air. The fog directly in front of my truck parted, like a curtain being drawn aside. It only cleared for a few seconds, just a small window in the gray, but it was enough. My headlights were shining on nothing. The road had disappeared. Not 10 feet in front of my bumper was the edge of a cliff, a sheer, black drop into nothingness. The yellow line I had been following had been painted by a road crew that had apparently quit for the day, leaving it ending abruptly at the precipice of an unfinished section of road that the fog had completely hidden. There were no barriers, no warning signs, nothing. If I hadn't stopped, I would have driven straight over the edge and into the abyss. I sat there paralyzed, staring at the spot where the road simply ceased to exist. My blood ran cold. The fog swirled back in, hiding the cliff from view once more, but I knew it was there. I could feel it. The whisper had saved my life. I don't know who or what I heard that day. Was it the ghost of a child who had met their end on this treacherous mountain? Was it a guardian angel? Or was it just my own subconscious, my own instincts manifesting as a voice to save me from a fatal mistake? I don't have the answers. All I know is that I sat there for a long time, shaking until the fog finally began to lift with the dawn. I backed my truck up, inch by painful inch, until I could turn around. I never finished that route. I don't believe in ghosts, but I believe in that whisper. And I believe that on the tail of the dragon, sometimes the things you can't see are the only things that can save you. My name is Mike O'Connor. I'm a trucker, born and bred. My dad was a trucker, my granddad was a trucker. The road is in my blood. I've always been a confident driver, maybe a little too confident. I respected the road, but I never feared it. I figured if you knew your truck and you knew your skills, you could handle anything. The tail of the dragon taught me how wrong I was. It taught me that sometimes skill isn't enough. Sometimes you need a miracle. The curve is infamous among truckers who have to run that route. They call it the Devil's Curve. It's a nasty off-camber decreasing radius turn that tries to pull you straight off the side of the mountain. It's claimed more than its fair share of vehicles over the years. I was hauling a full load of lumber, which made my center of gravity high and my rig unforgiving. I was coming into the curve, doing everything by the book, gear down, easy on the approach, ready to feather the brakes through the apex. I went to apply pressure to the brake pedal. Nothing happened. The pedal went straight to the floor with no resistance. It was a soft, mushy feeling that signaled a complete and total loss of hydraulic pressure. Every trucker's worst nightmare. A cold electric shock of pure terror shot through my entire body. I pumped the pedal frantically, nothing. I yanked the emergency brake. I heard a sickening snap and the handle went limp in my hand. The cable had broken. My rig, heavy with thousands of pounds of lumber, was now a runaway freight train on a collision course with the Devil's Curve. I was gaining speed, the engine screaming as I tried to downshift, but the momentum was too great. The turn was rushing towards me, a blur of gray rock and green trees. To my right was a solid rock wall. To my left was a rusty guardrail and a 1,000-foot drop into the valley below. My life didn't flash before my eyes. There was no time for that. There was only the curve, the cliff, and the certainty of my own death. My mind went into a strange, hyper-focused state. I could see every detail, the cracks in the asphalt, the individual leaves on the trees, the rust on the guardrail. I was wrestling with the wheel, trying to keep the truck from careening straight off the edge, but I knew it was a losing battle. The force of the turn was pulling me, dragging me towards the void. The tires were screaming, a high-pitched wail of tortured rubber. I was going to die. I closed my eyes. That's when I saw him. It wasn't with my eyes because they were squeezed shut. I saw him in my mind's eye, as clear as day. A figure, standing on the shoulder right at the sharpest point of the curve. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned uniform, something gray and worn. It looked like a Civil War uniform. His face was grim, shadowed by the brim of a wide hat. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, and he raised a long, bony arm and pointed. He was pointing directly at the rock wall on my right. It was an insane, suicidal impulse. But in that split second, with death a certainty on my left, insanity on my right seemed like the only option. My eyes snapped open. I didn't see the figure anymore, but the image of him pointing was burned into my brain. Without another thought, I wrenched the steering wheel to the right, away from the cliff, and aimed my truck at the solid rock face. I braced for the cataclysmic impact, the sound of my cab being crushed like a soda can. But the impact never came. At the very last second, my headlights illuminated something I hadn't seen, something that wasn't visible from the road. It was a narrow, almost invisible gap in the rock wall, hidden by overgrown bushes and shadows. It was a small, abandoned runoff lane, probably from an older version of the road long since forgotten. My truck shot into the narrow opening like a bullet. The space was barely wide enough for my rig. Branches and thorns scraped and screeched along both sides of my cab and trailer, the sound like 1,000 fingernails on a chalkboard. The runoff lane went uphill, and the incline, combined with the friction from the dense brush, did what my brakes couldn't. The truck slowed, groaning and shuddering, until it finally came to a stop, wedged tightly in the overgrown passage, no more than 50 feet from the main road. I sat there, my hands shaking uncontrollably, my heart feeling like it was going to explode out of my chest. I was alive. I was alive? The words just kept repeating in my head. After a few minutes, I managed to get the door open, pushing against the thick bushes. I stumbled out onto the ground, my legs like jelly. I looked back at the Devil's Curve, then at the hidden runoff lane my truck was now buried in. There was no way I could have seen it. It was completely concealed. No one could have known it was there. I walked back to the edge of the main road and looked at the spot where I had seen the figure. There was no one there, just an old gnarled oak tree and the rusty guardrail. I thought I was losing my mind, that the stress of the moment had made me hallucinate. But then I saw something on the ground, half hidden in the weeds near the base of the tree. It was an old corroded metal button, the kind you'd see on a military uniform. It was gray and heavy, with an eagle insignia on it barely visible through the tarnish. I picked it up. It was cold to the touch. I never found out for sure, but the locals I spoke to later told me stories. They said that stretch of road was near an old Civil War skirmish site. They said the ghost of a Confederate soldier was sometimes seen on that curve, a silent sentinel. They said he was a guardian watching over the road where his comrades had fallen. I don't know what I believe, but I know that my brakes failed. I know I was about to drive off a cliff, and I know that something or someone pointed me to the one and only path to survival. I still have that button. I keep it in my cab on the dashboard where I can see it. It's a reminder that on the road you're never truly alone, and that sometimes miracles come dressed in gray. My name is Calvin Brooks. I'm an independent hauler, which means I spend most of my life on the road alone. You get used to the solitude, you even start to like it. But there's a difference between being alone and being lonely, and there's a difference between being lonely and being haunted. On the tail of the dragon, I learned that last difference firsthand. It was a clear, moonless night. The stars were out, but they seemed distant and cold, offering no real light. My headlights cut a sharp, lonely path through the darkness. I was making good time, feeling comfortable with the rhythm of the road, the familiar dance of braking and accelerating, turning the wheel left, then right, then left again. It's a hypnotic process on the dragon. I was about 4 miles in when I got that strange feeling of being watched. It's a primal instinct, the hair on the back of your neck standing up. I checked my mirrors out of habit. On my left, I saw headlights. That was unusual. Most four-wheelers don't have the guts to try and pass a semi on this road, especially not at night. But these weren't car headlights. They were big, round, and high off the ground, just like mine. It was another truck. I eased off the gas a little, a courtesy to let him pass if he was in a hurry. But he didn't pass. He just pulled up alongside me, matching my speed perfectly. I glanced over. What I saw made my blood run cold. It was a truck, but it was like no truck I had ever seen. It was an old model, a Peterbilt or a Kenworth from the 70s, maybe even the 60s. It was painted a flat, matte black that seemed to absorb the light from my own headlamps. There were no company logos, no chrome, no reflective tape. It was just black, a void in the shape of a truck. The strangest part was the sound. There was none. My own engine was roaring, the wind was whistling past my windows, but from this massive machine right next to me there was only silence. It moved with a ghostly grace, its wheels turning on the asphalt without a single sound. The windows of the cab were tinted so dark they were opaque. I couldn't see a driver. I couldn't see anything inside. It was like looking at a photograph of a truck, not a real one. We were coming up on a sharp curve, and I had to slow down. The black truck slowed with me, staying perfectly in sync, its front bumper aligned with my cab door. It was like we were tethered together by an invisible rope. A wave of pure, unadulterated fear washed over me. This wasn't a race. This wasn't another trucker playing games. This was something wrong, something unnatural. I sped up, trying to pull ahead. The shadow truck matched my acceleration instantly, its silent engine keeping pace without effort. I slammed on my brakes, hoping to fall back. It braked with me, maintaining its position. We were driving side by side, taking up the entire two-lane road. If a car came from the other direction, we would all be dead. But the road remained empty. It was just me and this thing. This phantom rig. I started to sweat, my hands slipping on the steering wheel. I laid on my horn, a deafening blast that echoed through the mountains. The shadow truck did nothing. It just kept pace, a silent, menacing presence in the dark. We were approaching a narrow stone bridge, one of the oldest on the route. There was no way both of us could fit. It was a moment of truth. One of us had to yield, or we would collide and be sent plummeting into the ravine below. My heart was in my throat. I braced myself, ready to swerve, ready to do whatever it took to survive. As we reached the entrance to the bridge, the shadow truck did something that defied all logic. It swerved, but it didn't swerve away from me, it swerved towards me. For a split second, I thought it was going to ram me, to push me off the bridge. I saw its black grille filling my window. I yelled out, a raw, terrified sound. And then it drove right through me. There was no impact, no sound of crunching metal. Just a sudden, bone-deep cold that swept through my cab, making me gasp. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. For a fraction of a second, my cab was filled with an oppressive darkness and the smell of diesel exhaust and something else. Something like burnt ozone. And then it was gone. I looked in my passenger side mirror, my body trembling violently. I saw the shadow truck. It was on the other side of me now. It hadn't gone around me. It had passed through me. It continued on its impossible path, driving straight towards the stone guardrail of the bridge. It didn't slow down. It didn't swerve. It just kept going. It passed through the solid stone guardrail as if it were made of smoke. For a moment, its taillights, two faint red glows, hovered in the blackness over the ravine, and then they winked out, and it was gone. I pulled over as soon as I was off the bridge, my mind reeling, my body shaking. I got out and looked at my truck, expecting to see some kind of damage, some sign of the passage. There was nothing. My truck was fine, but the air was still cold and the smell of burnt ozone lingered. I've driven the Dragon since then, but only in the daytime. The night belongs to that road, and it belongs to the things that drive it. I don't know if it was a ghost, a premonition, or some kind of highway hypnosis. But I know what I saw. I saw a truck that wasn't there, a driver that didn't exist, and I felt the cold touch of the grave as it passed through me. Some truckers race for pink slips. That night, I think I was racing for my soul. My name is Denise Harper. I've been driving solo for a decade. When you're out on the road by yourself for weeks, sometimes months at a time, your truck becomes more than just a machine. It becomes your home, your shell, your entire world. And in that world, the radio is more than just a piece of equipment. It's your companion. It's the voice that keeps you awake on the long, hypnotic stretches of asphalt. It's the thread, however thin, that connects you to the world you left behind. My radio has always been a comfort, a familiar crackling presence in the dark. But one night on a lonely, mist-shrouded road called the Tail of the Dragon, it became a source of absolute soul-shaking terror. The job was a hotshot load of high-value electronics, and the schedule was brutally tight. A delay at the shipper in Nashville meant I had to make up time, and the only way to do that was to take the shortcut. US 129, the Dragon. It was well after midnight when I hit the start of the 11-mile stretch. The road was utterly deserted, and a thick, low-lying mist was rising from the damp asphalt, swirling in my headlights and making the world feel surreal and dreamlike. It was like driving through a ghost's breath. To keep the oppressive silence at bay, I had my radio tuned to an oldies station out of Knoxville. The familiar, cheerful tunes of the 60s and 70s, the Temptations, the Supremes, Creedence, were a comforting presence in the dark, lonely cab. They were songs of a simpler time, a stark contrast to the complex, demanding task of navigating a fully loaded 18-wheeler through 318 blind curves. I was deep in the rhythm of the road, my hands and feet moving in a practiced dance of braking, steering, and shifting. I was navigating a particularly nasty series of S-curves, a section they call the whip, when the music suddenly died. It didn't fade out gracefully. It was cut off, replaced by a loud, aggressive burst of white noise static. I figured the signal was finally giving out, lost for good in the deep valleys and thick forests of the Great Smoky Mountains. It happened all the time. I reached for the dial, my fingers ready to scan for another station, any other voice to fill the sudden, unnerving silence. But before my fingers could touch the knob, the static stopped as abruptly as it had begun. A man's voice came through the speakers. It was a voice unlike any I had ever heard on a radio. It was perfectly calm, perfectly clear, and unnervingly close. It had a rich, deep timbre, but there was no warmth in it. It was like a high-fidelity recording with no hiss, no crackle, no distortion. It sounded as if he were sitting in the passenger seat right next to me, speaking directly into my ear. "Hello, Denise," the voice said. I froze. My entire body went rigid. My blood, which had been warm and flowing, turned to ice water in my veins. It wasn't a DJ. There was no music, no jingle, no station identification. Just a voice that knew my name. "Who is this?" I managed to say, my own voice a choked, terrified whisper that was barely audible over the rumble of my engine. My rational mind, the part of me that had gotten me safely through a decade on the road, was scrambling, desperately trying to assemble a logical explanation. Was it a prank? Someone with a powerful modified CB radio who had seen the Denise Harper name painted on my truck door? But the voice wasn't crackly and distorted like a CB transmission. It was pure, clean, and resonant. It was impossible. The voice chuckled. It was a low, pleasant, almost charming sound that was somehow more terrifying than a scream. It was the sound of something that was completely in control. "Just a friend," it said, the words flowing smoothly from my speakers. "A friend who knows you're a long way from home. A long way from that little house in Flagstaff with the blue shutters and the peeling paint on the porch swing." My heart stopped. It literally felt as if an icy hand had reached into my chest and squeezed it shut. I had never told anyone on the road where I lived. My company had my address on file in a computer in Phoenix, of course, but this wasn't my dispatcher. The house, the blue shutters, the peeling paint on the swing I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. It was a detail so specific, so personal that only someone who had stood on my front lawn could possibly know it. "You're thinking about your son, Michael," the voice continued, its tone unnervingly conversational and friendly, as if we were old friends catching up. "You're worried about his grades in algebra. Don't be. He's a smart boy. He'll figure it out. He just misses his mom." Tears sprang to my eyes, hot and immediate. It was true. Every word was true. I had been on the phone with my son's teacher just the day before, a tense, frustrating conversation that had left me feeling guilty and helpless 1,000 miles away. How could this voice know that? The intimacy of it was a violation. It was peeling back the layers of my life, my private fears and worries, with a casual, effortless cruelty. Panic began to bubble up in my chest, hot and suffocating. This was impossible. This was insane. I was having a breakdown. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mixture of terror and anger. "Who are you?" "I just want to help, Denise," the voice said, and its tone shifted, all the feigned friendliness evaporating in an instant. It became serious, commanding, urgent. "The road ahead is dangerous. More dangerous than you know. You need to listen to me very carefully. Your life may depend on it." I was too terrified to do anything but listen. My truck was on autopilot, my hands and feet moving through the motions of driving while my conscious mind was held captive by the voice in the radio. "In about 1 mile, the voice said, its words precise and clear, "you will come around a sharp left-hand curve. At the apex of that curve, you will see a silver sedan pulled over on the shoulder. The hood will be up. A man in a gray suit will be standing next to it. He will try to flag you down. Do not stop, Denise. Do not even slow down. Keep your eyes on the road and keep driving. Do you understand me?" The command was absolute. A cold dread washed over me. "Why?" I whispered, my throat dry. "What's wrong with him? Is it a trap?" There was a long, heavy pause. The silence stretched on, filled only by the low rumble of my engine and the frantic pounding of my own heart. The pause felt ancient, filled with a knowledge I couldn't begin to comprehend. Then the voice came back, and all the warmth, all the life was gone from it. It was cold, flat and final, like the sound of a tomb door closing. "He is not what he appears to be," it said. "Just don't stop." And then the radio crackled with static again. A brief, violent burst, and the oldies station faded back in. A cheerful, upbeat Motown song filled the cab, the singer's voice full of joy and life. It was so jarring, so completely at odds with the cold terror of the last few minutes that it felt like a form of madness. It was as if the whole conversation had never happened. But the fear was still there, a cold, hard knot of ice in the pit of my stomach. I drove on, my mind racing. Was I going crazy? Had I fallen asleep for a second and had a vivid, terrifying dream? A highway hypnosis? But it had felt so real. The voice, the details about my life, they were real. I kept driving, my eyes glued to the road, my body tense. I counted down the seconds, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. 1 mile. He said it would be 1 mile. I passed a gnarled oak tree that looked like a skeletal hand reaching for the sky. I navigated a sharp right turn, and then I saw the curve ahead, a sharp, blind left-hander, just as the voice had described. I took a deep breath and eased my rig into the turn. My headlights swung around, cutting through the mist, and there it was. A silver sedan, a late-model Lexus, pulled over on the narrow gravel shoulder. The hood was up, and standing next to it, illuminated in the stark white glare of my headlights, was a man in a perfectly tailored gray suit. He looked utterly out of place, too clean, too neat, too composed for someone who had broken down on a deserted mountain road in the middle of the night. As I approached, he turned to face my truck and he raised his hand, not in a frantic wave for help, but in a slow, calm, beckoning gesture. The image of him is burned into my memory for all time. He was tall and unnaturally thin. His face was pale, a waxy, bloodless white, and his eyes were dark, empty pits. They didn't reflect my headlights. They just absorbed the light, leaving two black holes in his face. His expression was one of unnerving calm, a faint, thin-lipped smile playing on his lips. It was not the face of a stranded motorist. It was the face of a predator. The voice's warning echoed in my head, a frantic, screaming mantra. Don't stop! Don't stop! Don't stop! My foot was hovering over the brake pedal, my ingrained human instinct to help screaming at me to stop. But the memory of that cold, disembodied voice and the sight of those dead, empty eyes was stronger. I gripped the steering wheel, kept my eyes fixed on the yellow line in the road ahead, and drove right past him. As I passed, I risked a glance in my passenger side mirror. The man in the gray suit was still standing there, but he had dropped his hand. He was watching me go, that same calm, chilling smile on his face. And as my truck pulled away, his form seemed to waver. For a split second, in the swirling mist and the red glow of my taillights, he looked less solid, his sharp suit and pale face blurring at the edges, becoming indistinct, like a figure made of smoke. I snapped my eyes back to the road, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't look in the mirror again. I just drove, pushing my rig through the remaining curves of the Dragon, my mind a maelstrom of terror and confusion. Who or what was the voice on the radio? A guardian angel? A spirit of the road? And who or what was the man in the gray suit? A ghost? A demon? One of the local legends I'd heard whispered at truck stops, a story about a collector who walks the lonely roads at night offering help to the desperate, but always at a terrible price. I never got an answer. The voice on the radio never returned. But I know that I was given a choice on that road. I was warned. And I listened. I don't know what fate I avoided that night by driving on, but I know with a certainty that chills me to my core that if I had stopped, if I had opened my door to the man with the empty eyes, I would have never driven out of those mountains. My truck would have been found empty on the side of the road, and I would have become just another story, another whispered legend of the tale of the Dragon. My name is Troy Simmons. I'm not a man given to flights of fancy. For 25 years, my world has been defined by tangible, measurable things. The greasy feel of a kingpin lock, the solid, reassuring clunk of a trailer connecting, the deep, vibrating groan of 18 wheels turning on asphalt. The road, to me, has always been a simple equation of physics and mechanics. It's rock, tar, and paint. It doesn't think, it doesn't feel, it doesn't hold grudges. That's the gospel I lived by, the creed that got me through millions of miles of lonely highway. But one moonless night on that twisted ribbon of road they call the Tale of the Dragon, I learned that some roads are different, some roads are hungry, and some roads, when they've fed, have to bleed. The night began like 1,000 others. I was deadheading, pulling an empty 48-foot trailer back to the yard in Knoxville. An empty trailer, or a skate as we sometimes call it, makes a rig feel jumpy, skittish, like a horse that's been spooked. The weight isn't there to hold you to the ground, so every bump, every gust of wind, every slight overcorrection of the wheel feels magnified. It demands a lighter touch, a deeper focus. And on the Dragon, focus is everything. The darkness was profound, an ink-black absolute void that you only find deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far from the polluting glow of any city. It was a primal darkness, the kind that feels ancient and heavy. My headlights were the only things proving the world still existed, carving a frantic, moving tunnel of reality through the oppressive canvas of the void. The dragon was quiet. I hadn't seen another soul, not a single pair of headlights or taillights for miles. It felt like I was the last man on Earth, piloting my rig through a forgotten, sleeping world. The Cherokee people, the original inhabitants of these mountains, had their own names for this place. They spoke of spirits that lived in the streams and the ancient trees. They had legends of the Uktena, a great horned serpent that was said to live in the highest, most remote mountain passes. As a kid, my grandfather, who was part Cherokee himself, used to tell me these stories. He said that some parts of the mountains were older than memory, and that they didn't like to be disturbed. He told me that the road, US 129, was a scar on the face of something ancient, and scars have a tendency to ache and sometimes to bleed. I'd always dismissed them as old folk tales, campfire stories to scare the children. That night, huddled in the sterile, diesel-scented bubble of my cab, those stories didn't feel so distant. I was about 6 miles into the 11-mile stretch, my speed reduced to a crawl, my hands gripping the wheel with a pressure that was making my knuckles ache. The road here was a relentless series of blind corners and hairpin turns, demanding a constant rhythm of braking, downshifting, and turning. It's a dance, and if you miss a step, the mountain will claim you. I was coming around a particularly tight blind right-hander, one the locals call the whip. The rock face on the left is so close you feel like you can reach out and touch it, while the right side is a sheer, unguarded drop into a black abyss of pine and shadow. As my headlights swung around, cutting through the darkness, they illuminated the stretch of road ahead. And that's when I saw it. A patch on the asphalt. It was large, dark, and wet, glistening under the high beams of my Kenworth like a fresh oil slick. My first thought, the logical trucker part of my brain taking over, was that it was a spill. Oil maybe, or hydraulic fluid from a truck that had blown a line. It happened. But as I drew closer, my initial assessment began to crumble. The color was wrong. It wasn't the iridescent black of oil or the murky brown of hydraulic fluid. It was a deep, dark, sickening red, the color of a fresh wound. My second thought, the one that made my stomach clench into a tight, cold knot, was that it was blood. I've been on the road a long time. I've been the first on the scene of more than one horrific accident. I know what a crash site looks like. This looked like the immediate grisly aftermath of a terrible one. The kind where you don't look for survivors, you just wait for the coroner. I slowed the rig down even more, the air brakes hissing softly in the dead quiet of the night. My eyes, wide with a growing sense of dread, scanned the scene with a frantic, practiced intensity. I looked at the shoulder, the steep drop-off, the rock wall. I was looking for the source, for wreckage, for a twisted motorcycle, for the shattered remains of a car, for a body, for anyone who might need help. There was nothing. The guardrail, where there was one, was intact. The rock face was unscratched. The abyss to my right was silent and dark, showing no signs of a vehicle having plunged into it. There was just the silent, watching trees, their branches like skeletal fingers pointing at the sky, and that awful, spreading stain on the road. It was as if a giant had been wounded in the sky above and had bled all over this one specific patch of asphalt. It was then that I noticed the smell. It was a slow, creeping thing seeping through the closed vents of my cab, bypassing the air freshener hanging from my mirror. It was a thick, coppery, metallic scent, the unmistakable stomach-turning smell of fresh blood. And there was a lot of it. The sheer volume of the odor was overwhelming, so potent it made my eyes water and the back of my throat burn. A cold dread, heavy and suffocating, settled over me. This wasn't just fear, it was a primal, instinctual revulsion. What in God's name could have bled that much and left no other trace? My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. An animal? A large black bear or a big buck, maybe? I've hit deer before. They make a mess, a terrible mess. But this was different. This was too much. The stain too large, too concentrated. It covered nearly the entire southbound lane, a ghastly pool that seemed to soak into the very fabric of the road. And there was no body. No fur, no broken bones, nothing to indicate an animal had been there. I brought my truck to a complete stop about 50 feet from the edge of the stain. The silence that descended when the engine idled down was terrifying. It was a dead, listening silence. My headlights painted the scene in a stark, brutal white light. The red of the stain was so deep it was almost black in the center, thinning out to a brighter crimson at the edges where it was still spreading, still seeping into the porous asphalt. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my hand hovering over the CB radio microphone. Should I call it in? What would I even say? There's a big puddle of blood on the road at mile marker 6, but there's no accident. They'd think I was drunk or crazy. Still, I had to do something. My conscience wouldn't let me just drive away. As I stared, my eyes trying to make sense of the impossible scene, my headlights directly on the patch, the world tilted on its axis. The impossible happened. It moved. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't my tired eyes playing games on me after a long shift. The dark, wet stain on the blacktop began to move with a purpose. It began to contract, to pull itself together. The thin, spreading edges of the pool seemed to reverse course, flowing inward as if drawn by an unseen magnet. The liquid which had been seeping into the cracks and crevices of the road began to unseep, drawing itself out and coalescing into a single, deeper, darker pool of crimson. It was like watching a video in reverse, a gruesome spill unspilling itself right before my eyes. I stared, my mouth agape, my mind utterly failing to comprehend what my eyes were seeing. This defied every law of physics, every rule of nature I had ever known. The pool of liquid, now gathered into a tight circular mass, began to rise. It swelled upward, defying gravity, taking on a three-dimensional form. It thickened, the surface tension shimmering under my headlights like dark, oiled muscle. It was mounding up from the flat road surface, a quivering, gelatinous dome of pure, liquid gore. The mound grew, stretching upward, elongating, forming a shape. It was a humanoid shape, crude and lumpy at first, like a child's statue made of thick, dark clay. But it refined itself as it rose, stretching and solidifying. It rose to the height of a tall man, a featureless silhouette of glistening deep red against the black of the night. It had a head, a torso, 2 arms, 2 legs, all formed from the very substance of the stain that had moments before been flat on the road. It stood in the middle of my lane, directly in my path, a being made of blood and animated by some terrible unknown force. I was completely, utterly frozen. My foot was hovering uselessly over the brake pedal, my hands locked onto the steering wheel in a death grip. I tried to scream, but my throat had closed up. No sound would come out. I couldn't even breathe. My lungs were paralyzed, my chest a block of ice. My entire universe had shrunk to the sight of this impossible creature standing in the glare of my headlights. The thing, this blood creature, this elemental of the road, slowly turned its head towards me. The movement was fluid yet unnatural, like thick liquid pouring in slow motion. Its face was a blank, featureless expanse of glistening red. And then, 2 points of light ignited within its formless head. They weren't eyes in the traditional sense. They were like 2 burning embers being fanned to life in a dying fire. They glowed with a dull, malevolent red light, and they fixed on me. In that moment, I knew this was no mindless monster. It was an intelligence, It was aware of me. It saw me. It knew I was there, and in the depths of those glowing, hateful eyes I felt an ancient, bottomless rage. It was the rage of the mountain, the rage of the desecrated land, the rage of every life that had been violently spilled upon this stretch of asphalt. It was a hatred so pure and so profound that I felt it in the very marrow of my bones. It wasn't just a monster, it was a judgment. For a timeless second, a moment that stretched into an eternity, we were locked in that gaze. Me, a terrified, insignificant man in a metal box. And it, an impossible nightmare born from the road itself. A manifestation of all the pain and violence the dragon had witnessed. The air in my cab grew thick and cold, and the coppery smell of blood intensified until I was gagging on it. Then, as slowly and deliberately as it had formed, it began to collapse. The humanoid shape lost its integrity, its form wavering like a reflection in disturbed water. It began to melt back down into itself, the head and shoulders sinking into the torso, the arms and legs dissolving back into the main mass. The glowing red eyes held my gaze for a second longer, and then they extinguished, winking out into nothingness. The form sank back down into the asphalt, spreading out once more into a wet, dark, glistening stain, completely indistinguishable from how I had first seen it. It was just a patch on the road again. The spell was broken. Air rushed back into my lungs in a ragged, desperate gasp. My body was trembling violently, uncontrollably. The fight-or-flight instinct, which had been frozen solid by sheer terror, came roaring back to life. I didn't think. I just reacted. I stomped on the accelerator, my foot pushing the pedal to the floor. The Kenworth's powerful engine roared in protest, a bellow of defiance in the dead night. I wrenched the wheel to the left, swerving around the patch, not daring to drive through it. I couldn't bear the thought of my tires touching it. My rig veered into the oncoming lane, my tires screeching on the edge of the shoulder, kicking up gravel that pinged against my undercarriage. I straightened out and flew through the rest of the dragon, my speed far too fast for the treacherous curves. I didn't care. I didn't look back. I didn't dare look in my rearview mirror. I was terrified of what I might see. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main highway, the bright, comforting lights of a 24-hour truck stop visible in the distance. I pulled into the lot, my hands shaking so badly I could barely put the truck in park. I stumbled out of the cab and was violently sick in the parking lot, my body finally expelling the terror it had been holding on to. I've tried to rationalize it since. I've spent countless sleepless nights trying to convince myself it was a hallucination, a waking dream brought on by exhaustion and the hypnotic nature of the road. A highway hypnosis of the most terrifying kind. But I can't. I can't forget the smell. I can't forget the sight of it rising from the road, a fluid sculpture of death. And I can't shake the feeling that I saw something I was never meant to see. A glimpse behind the curtain of reality into the dark, hungry heart of a place. The old stories say the dragon has a spirit, that it's a hungry road, that it claims lives to feed itself. That night I think I saw what it does with them. It doesn't just claim them, it consumes them, it absorbs them, makes them a part of its very being. The road is not just rock and tar. On the tail of the dragon it's flesh and blood, and it remembers everything that has been spilled on it. My name is Wanda Pierce. I've been driving for just over 5 years, which in the grand fraternity of the road makes me a relative newcomer. I haven't logged the millions of miles that turn a person's spine into a question mark and their memories into a blurry montage of state lines and truck stops. Maybe that's why this hit me so hard. I hadn't become jaded yet. My sense of wonder hadn't been completely paved over by cynicism. I hadn't learned to explain away the unexplainable with a tired shrug and a gulp of stale coffee. All I know is that for a few terrifying, eternity-long minutes on the tail of the dragon, I was stripped of all the trappings of the modern world. I felt like the first human being on Earth, a small, fragile creature huddled by a dying fire while the real ancient owners of the night watched me from the darkness, their silent judgment a weight heavier than any cargo I'd ever hauled. The haul itself was routine, a short run carrying processed lumber from a mill in Tennessee to a construction supplier in North Carolina. It was a run I'd made a dozen times before, but always during the day. This time, a delay at the mill had pushed my departure back by hours, and I found myself facing the dragon well after midnight. The night was clear and surprisingly mild for late autumn, the air crisp and clean. I was ahead of the revised schedule, a rare gift in this line of work, and the pressure was off. The road was mine. There's a small unmarked pull-off about halfway through the dragon's 11-mile gauntlet. It's little more than a gravel patch carved out of the mountainside, a tiny concession of level ground in a world of relentless curves and inclines. It's quiet there, almost unnervingly so. Feeling the familiar ache in my lower back and the caffeine jitters from the long day, I decided to pull over for a few minutes, a chance to stretch my legs, top off my coffee from my thermos, and just breathe air that wasn't filtered through my truck's ventilation system. I eased the big Peterbilt onto the gravel, the crunch of the tires the only sound breaking the stillness. I killed the engine, and the sudden, profound silence was almost deafening. The constant, familiar rumble that had been my companion for hours was gone, replaced by a quiet so deep it felt like a physical presence. After a moment, the subtle sounds of the forest began to filter in, the gentle chirping of crickets, the faint whispery rustle of dry leaves skittering across the asphalt in a phantom breeze. It was peaceful. I stepped out of the cab, my boots sinking slightly into the loose gravel. I stretched my arms high over my head, my back cracking in a satisfying series of pops. I walked to the edge of the pull-off and breathed in the cool, clean mountain air. It smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and something else, something wild and ancient. The moon was a slim silver crescent providing almost no light, but the sky was a breathtaking tapestry of stars. A brilliant, scattered diamond dust you can only appreciate when you're miles from the light pollution of any city. For a moment, I felt a profound sense of calm, a connection to the ancient sleeping mountains that surrounded me. Their massive, dark shoulders hunched against the starry sky. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated peace, and then the crickets stopped. It happened all at once, in a single, coordinated instant. 1 second, the night was filled with their rhythmic, comforting chorus. The next, there was a dead, absolute, listening silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was a heavy, expectant void. It's the kind of silence that every animal, including the human one, recognizes on a primal level. It's the silence that means something is wrong. It's the silence that means a predator is near. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood up with a static prickle. The peaceful night air suddenly felt cold and heavy. I felt exposed, a solitary, soft-bodied creature standing in a small, weak circle of light, a beacon in an ocean of darkness. I had the distinct, unnerving sensation of being watched. It wasn't a vague feeling of paranoia. It was a focused, intense pressure, like the feeling of 1,000 unseen eyes boring into my back. I turned slowly, my heart beginning a low, heavy thud against my ribs. I scanned the area. The pull-off was empty. The road was deserted in both directions, a winding black ribbon disappearing into the darkness. My gaze was inevitably drawn to the tree line. The forest that borders the dragon is not the friendly, managed woodland of a state park. It is a thick, old, primeval forest, a tangled, impenetrable wall of black trunks, dense undergrowth, and deep, bottomless shadows. My truck's parking lights cast a weak amber glow, but their light was swallowed by the woods just a few feet in. It was a solid wall of black, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in there just beyond the veil of darkness looking out at me. I tried to rationalize it, my modern logical mind fighting against the ancient instinctual fear. "It's just a deer, Wanda," I whispered to myself, the sound of my own voice startlingly loud in the silence. "Or a bear. You're in the Smokies, for crying out loud. I've seen plenty of wildlife on the road. I'd seen bears amble across the highway, herds of deer graze peacefully on the shoulder. But this felt different. This wasn't the passive, indifferent presence of an animal going about its business. This felt intelligent. It felt observant. There was a coordinated, focused attention to it that made my skin crawl. I decided my little break was officially over. The coffee could wait. I needed the solid steel and glass of my cab around me. I turned to walk back to the truck, and that's when a flicker of movement in the darkness caught the edge of my vision. It was a quick, furtive shift, something moving in the blackness just beyond the reach of the light. I stopped dead, my hand halfway to the truck's door. I stared hard into the tree line, my eyes straining, trying to make out what it was. My heart was pounding now, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. And then I saw them. The first one was a pair of eyes. They were low to the ground, perhaps at the height of a large dog or a wolf, and they glowed with a faint, self-luminous pale green light. They weren't reflecting my truck's lights. They were generating their own. They were like 2 drops of phosphorescent paint floating in the absolute black. They blinked once, a slow, deliberate reptilian blink before I could even process what I was seeing. To the left of that pair, another pair of eyes ignited in the darkness, and then another to the right, and another higher up. Within the space of a few seconds, the entire tree line, as far as I could see in either direction, was filled with them. It was a spectacle of pure, unadulterated nightmare. There were dozens of pairs of glowing eyes, all staring at me from the impenetrable black of the forest. They were at different heights, creating a terrifying, multi-layered audience. Some were low to the ground, like the first pair I saw. Others were at the height of a man, and some, chillingly, were much higher up, 7, maybe 8 feet off the ground, looking down at me from between the high branches of the trees. Their colors varied. Most were the same sickly, luminous green, but some were a baleful, feverish yellow, and a few in the deepest, darkest parts of the woods glowed with a faint, malevolent red, like the dying embers of a fire. This was not a pack of wolves. This was not a herd of deer. This was not any known animal I had ever seen or read about. The sheer number of them, the impossible variation in their height, the sheer coordinated stillness of their observation. It was profoundly, fundamentally unnatural. They didn't move. They didn't make a sound. They just watched me, their luminous, unblinking eyes fixed on me, the lone, fragile, brightly lit creature in their domain. My breath hitched in my throat. I was prey. That's the only word for what I felt. It was a deep, cellular understanding that stripped away all my confidence, all my identity as a capable professional trucker. In that moment, I was just a piece of meat that had wandered into the wrong territory. I was a mouse that had stumbled into a den of 1,000 snakes. I remembered the old Cherokee legends my grandfather had told me, stories I had dismissed as folklore. He spoke of the Sul Kalu, the slant-eyed giant, a great lord of the game who lived in the mountains and whose children were the wild things of the forest. He said that to see them was a bad omen, a sign that you had trespassed where you were not welcome. He also spoke of the Yunwi Tsunzdi, the little people, who were known to be tricksters, but who could also be fiercely protective of the mountains and hostile to those who disrespected them. Were these the spirits of the mountain? The guardians of the forest roused by my intrusion? Then a sound started. It began as a low vibration, something I felt in the soles of my boots before I heard it. It grew into a low, guttural growl, but it seemed to come from all directions at once. It wasn't a single animal, it was a chorus, a symphony of menace. The sound seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in the air, in the ground, in the very marrow of my bones. It was a sound of pure primal threat, a warning and a promise of imminent violence. That sound broke my paralysis. I didn't wait for a second invitation. I scrambled back into my cab in a clumsy, panicked rush, my hands fumbling with the cold metal of the door handle. I threw myself inside, slammed the heavy door shut, and hit the lock button with a trembling finger. The solid thud of the lock engaging was the most comforting sound I had ever heard. I didn't even bother to start the engine right away. I just sat there, my back pressed hard against the seat, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. I stared at the tree line. The eyes were still there, all of them. A silent, glittering, multicolored audience of malice. The growling continued, a constant, terrifying hum that surrounded the truck, a physical pressure against the glass and steel. I could feel the vibration through the frame of the rig. They were surrounding me. My shaking hand finally managed to get the key into the ignition and turn it. The big diesel engine roared to life, its familiar, powerful thunder a defiant shout against the unnatural silence of the forest. My other hand flew to the dashboard and flicked on my high beams. The world outside my windshield exploded with light. The powerful, piercing beams of my high beams flooded the edge of the forest, turning the night into a stark, overexposed day. And the eyes vanished, all of them at once. In the blink of an eye, they were simply gone. The growling stopped, cut off as if a switch had been flipped. There was nothing there, just trees and shadows and leaves. It was as if they had never existed. The silence that returned was just as profound, but now it felt empty, not expectant. But I knew they had been there. The terror coiling in my gut was real. The memory of those dozens of glowing, watching eyes was burned into my brain. I threw the truck into gear, the transmission grinding in my haste, and peeled out of that pull-off, spraying a plume of gravel everywhere. I didn't just drive away, I fled. I drove the rest of the way through the Dragon with my high beams on, my knuckles white on the wheel, my eyes darting back and forth between the twisting road and the dark, silent tree line. Every shadow seemed to hold a shape. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep. The feeling of being hunted, of being scrutinized by a multitude of ancient, hungry eyes, didn't leave me until I saw the first welcoming lights of a distant town, a sign that I was out of the mountains and back in the comforting, artificial light of my own kind. I don't know what lives in those ancient woods. I don't know if they were spirits or cryptids or something else entirely, something for which we have no name. I don't know what they wanted or what they would have done if I had stayed outside my truck for 1 second longer. And I know, with every fiber of my being, that I never ever want to find out. Some places are older than us and they have rules we don't understand. That night I broke one of them, and I was lucky to be allowed to leave with just the memory. My name is Wanda Pierce. I've been driving for just over 5 years, which in the grand fraternity of the road makes me a relative newcomer. I haven't logged the millions of miles that turn a person's spine into a question mark and their memories into a blurry montage of state lines and truck stops. Maybe that's why this hit me so hard. I hadn't become jaded yet. My sense of wonder hadn't been completely paved over by cynicism. I hadn't learned to explain away the unexplainable with a tired shrug and a gulp of stale coffee. All I know is that for a few terrifying eternity-long minutes on the tail of the Dragon, I was stripped of all the trappings of the modern world. I felt like the first human being on Earth. a small, fragile creature huddled by a dying fire while the real, ancient owners of the night watched me from the darkness, their silent judgment a weight heavier than any cargo I'd ever hauled. The haul itself was routine, a short run carrying processed lumber from a mill in Tennessee to a construction supplier in North Carolina. It was a run I'd made a dozen times before, but always during the day. This time, a delay at the mill had pushed my departure back by hours, and I found myself facing the dragon well after midnight. The night was clear and surprisingly mild for late autumn, the air crisp and clean. I was ahead of the revised schedule, a rare gift in this line of work, and the pressure was off. The road was mine. There's a small unmarked pull-off about halfway through the dragon's 11-mile gauntlet. It's little more than a gravel patch carved out of the mountainside, a tiny concession of level ground in a world of relentless curves and inclines. It's quiet there, almost unnervingly so. Feeling the familiar ache in my lower back and the caffeine jitters from the long day, I decided to pull over for a few minutes. A chance to stretch my legs, top off my coffee from my thermos, and just breathe air that wasn't filtered through my truck's ventilation system. I eased the big Peterbilt onto the gravel, the crunch of the tires the only sound breaking the stillness. I killed the engine, and the sudden, profound silence was almost deafening. The constant, familiar rumble that had been my companion for hours was gone, replaced by a quiet so deep it felt like a physical presence. After a moment, the subtle sounds of the forest began to filter in. The gentle chirping of crickets, the faint whispery rustle of dry leaves skittering across the asphalt in a phantom breeze. It was peaceful. I stepped out of the cab, my boots sinking slightly into the loose gravel. I stretched my arms high over my head, my back cracking in a satisfying series of pops. I walked to the edge of the pull-off and breathed in the cool, clean mountain air. It smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and something else, something wild and ancient. The moon was a slim silver crescent, providing almost no light, but the sky was a breathtaking tapestry of stars, a brilliant, scattered diamond dust you can only appreciate when you're miles from the light pollution of any city. For a moment, I felt a profound sense of calm, a connection to the ancient sleeping mountains that surrounded me, their massive, dark shoulders hunched against the starry sky. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated peace. And then the crickets stopped. It happened all at once, in a single, coordinated instant. 1 second, the night was filled with their rhythmic, comforting chorus. The next, there was a dead, absolute listening silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a heavy, expectant void. It's the kind of silence that every animal, including the human one, recognizes on a primal level. It's the silence that means something is wrong. It's the silence that means a predator is near. The hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood up with a static prickle. The peaceful night air suddenly felt cold and heavy. I felt exposed, a solitary, soft-bodied creature standing in a small, weak circle of light, a beacon in an ocean of darkness. I had the distinct, unnerving sensation of being watched. It wasn't a vague feeling of paranoia. It was a focused, intense pressure, like the feeling of 1,000 unseen eyes boring into my back. I turned slowly, my heart beginning a low, heavy thud against my ribs. I scanned the area. The pull-off was empty. The road was deserted in both directions, a winding black ribbon disappearing into the darkness. My gaze was inevitably drawn to the tree line. The forest that borders the dragon is not the friendly, managed woodland of a state park. It is a thick, old, primeval forest, a tangled, impenetrable wall of black trunks, dense undergrowth, and deep, bottomless shadows. My truck's parking lights cast a weak amber glow, but their light was swallowed by the woods just a few feet in. It was a solid wall of black. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in there, just beyond the veil of darkness, looking out at me. I tried to rationalize it, my modern logical mind fighting against the ancient instinctual fear. "It's just a deer, Wanda," I whispered to myself, the sound of my own voice startlingly loud in the silence. "Or a bear. You're in the Smokies, for crying out loud." I've seen plenty of wildlife on the road. I'd seen bears amble across the highway, herds of deer graze peacefully on the shoulder. But this felt different. This wasn't the passive, indifferent presence of an animal going about its business. This felt intelligent. It felt observant. There was a coordinated, focused attention to it that made my skin crawl. I decided my little break was officially over. The coffee could wait. I needed the solid steel and glass of my cab around me. I turned to walk back to the truck, and that's when a flicker of movement in the darkness caught the edge of my vision. It was a quick, furtive shift, something moving in the blackness just beyond the reach of the light. I stopped dead, my hand halfway to the truck's door. I stared hard into the tree line, my eyes straining, trying to make out what it was. My heart was pounding now, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. And then I saw them. The first one was a pair of eyes. They were low to the ground, perhaps at the height of a large dog or a wolf, and they glowed with a faint, self-luminous, pale green light. They weren't reflecting my truck's lights, they were generating their own. They were like 2 drops of phosphorescent paint floating in the absolute black. They blinked once, a slow, deliberate reptilian blink. Before I could even process what I was seeing, to the left of that pair, another pair of eyes ignited in the darkness, and then another to the right, and another higher up. Within the space of a few seconds, the entire tree line, as far as I could see in either direction, was filled with them. It was a spectacle of pure, unadulterated nightmare. There were dozens of pairs of glowing eyes, all staring at me from the impenetrable black of the forest. They were at different heights, creating a terrifying, multi-layered audience. Some were low to the ground, like the first pair I saw. Others were at the height of a man. And some, chillingly, were much higher up, 7, maybe 8 feet off the ground, looking down at me from between the high branches of the trees. Their colors varied. Most were the same sickly, luminous green. But some were a baleful, feverish yellow, and a few in the deepest, darkest parts of the woods glowed with a faint, malevolent red, like the dying embers of a fire. This was not a pack of wolves. This was not a herd of deer. This was not any known animal I had ever seen or read about. The sheer number of them, the impossible variation in their height, the sheer coordinated stillness of their observation. It was profoundly, fundamentally unnatural. They didn't move. They didn't make a sound. They just watched me, their luminous, unblinking eyes fixed on me, the lone, fragile, brightly lit creature in their domain. My breath hitched in my throat. I was prey. That's the only word for what I felt. It was a deep cellular understanding that stripped away all my confidence, all my identity as a capable professional trucker. In that moment, I was just a piece of meat that had wandered into the wrong territory. I was a mouse that had stumbled into a den of 1,000 snakes. I remembered the old Cherokee legends my grandfather had told me, stories I had dismissed as folklore. He spoke of the Tsul'kalu', the slant-eyed giant, a great lord of the game who lived in the mountains and whose children were the wild things of the forest. He said that to see them was a bad omen, a sign that you had trespassed where you were not welcome. He also spoke of the Yunwi Tsunsdi, the little people who were known to be tricksters but who could also be fiercely protective of the mountains and hostile to those who disrespected them. Were these the spirits of the mountain, the guardians of the forest roused by my intrusion? Then a sound started. It began as a low vibration, something I felt in the soles of my boots before I heard it. It grew into a low, guttural growl, but it seemed to come from all directions at once. It wasn't a single animal. It was a chorus, a symphony of menace. The sound seemed to emanate from the very trees themselves, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in the air, in the ground, in the very marrow of my bones. It was a sound of pure primal threat, a warning and a promise of imminent violence. That sound broke my paralysis. I didn't wait for a second invitation. I scrambled back into my cab in a clumsy, panicked rush, my hands fumbling with the cold metal of the door handle. I threw myself inside, slammed the heavy door shut, and hit the lock button with a trembling finger. The solid thud of the lock engaging was the most comforting sound I had ever heard. I didn't even bother to start the engine right away. I just sat there, my back pressed hard against the seat, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. I stared at the tree line. The eyes were still there, all of them, a silent, glittering, multicolored audience of malice. The growling continued, a constant, terrifying hum that surrounded the truck, a physical pressure against the glass and steel. I could feel the vibration through the frame of the rig. They were surrounding me. My shaking hand finally managed to get the key into the ignition and turn it. The big diesel engine roared to life, its familiar, powerful thunder a defiant shout against the unnatural silence of the forest. My other hand flew to the dashboard and flicked on my high beams. The world outside my windshield exploded with light. The powerful, piercing beams of my high beams flooded the edge of the forest, turning the night into a stark, overexposed day. And the eyes vanished. All of them at once. In the blink of an eye, they were simply gone. The growling stopped, cut off as if a switch had been flipped. There was nothing there, just trees and shadows and leaves. It was as if they had never existed. The silence that returned was just as profound, but now it felt empty, not expectant. But I knew they had been there. The terror coiling in my gut was real. The memory of those dozens of glowing, watching eyes was burned into my brain. I threw the truck into gear, the transmission grinding in my haste, and peeled out of that pull-off, spraying a plume of gravel everywhere. I didn't just drive away, I fled. I drove the rest of the way through the Dragon with my high beams on, my knuckles white on the wheel, my eyes darting back and forth between the twisting road and the dark, silent tree line. Every shadow seemed to hold a shape. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep. The feeling of being hunted, of being scrutinized by a multitude of ancient, hungry eyes, didn't leave me until I saw the first welcoming lights of a distant town, a sign that I was out of the mountains and back in the comforting, artificial light of my own kind. I don't know what lives in those ancient woods. I don't know if they were spirits or cryptids or something else entirely, something for which we have no name. I don't know what they wanted or what they would have done if I had stayed outside my truck for 1 second longer. And I know with every fiber of my being that I never ever want to find out. Some places are older than us and they have rules we don't understand. That night I broke one of them, and I was lucky to be allowed to leave with just the memory. My name is Patricia Vaughn, but on the Citizens Band radio, the lifeline of the American trucker, they call me Paddy Wagon. It's a handle I've had for the better part of 30 years, a name that has crackled through speakers in every state of the lower 48. I've been a trucker for most of my adult life, a woman in a world still largely dominated by men. You learn to be tough, to be self-reliant, to trust your gut and your machine in equal measure. The CB has always been my constant companion, a character in its own right. It's a chorus of voices that warns of speed traps, smoky reports, alerts you to accidents, parking lots, up ahead, and sometimes just keeps you company with tall tales and lonely truths through the long, dark, solitary nights. I've heard a million stories on those airwaves, stories of ghost lights, phantom hitchhikers, and shadow trucks. I always listened with a patient, skeptical smile, chalking them up to too much coffee and too little sleep. They were just road stories. Until one cold, brittle night on the tail of the dragon, when I stopped being a listener and became part of the story myself. The night was achingly cold and unnervingly clear. The kind of cold that feels like it could crack the world open, where the air itself feels brittle and sharp in your lungs. The moon was a high, hard diamond in a black velvet sky, casting long, skeletal shadows from the ancient trees. I was making my way through the dragon, taking it slow and easy, my hands light but firm on the wheel. My rig, a classic Peterbilt 379 with more miles on it than I care to count, felt like an extension of my own body. I knew its every groan, its every shudder. The road was mine. I hadn't seen another vehicle, not so much as the flicker of a taillight, for almost an hour. The dragon at night is a lonely place. Most drivers, even the ones who have to run this route, avoid it after sundown. It's a road that demands respect, and at night, it demands more. It demands your undivided soul. My CB was on as it always was, but the channel was dead silent. The usual cacophony of chatter had faded as I'd climbed deeper into the mountains, the signals swallowed by the dense woods and deep hollows. The only sounds were the low, steady rumble of my engine, the hum of the tires on the cold asphalt, and the occasional hiss of the air brakes as I navigated another hairpin turn. The silence was so profound it felt sacred, like I was driving through a great sleeping cathedral of rock and pine. I was just passing the small green reflective sign for mile marker 4. I remember it vividly. The sign was slightly bent, as if something had clipped it long ago. The number 4 glowed an eerie green in my headlights. It was at that exact moment that the silence was shattered. The radio crackled to life, a burst of static so loud and so sudden it made me jump in my seat. It wasn't the usual background hiss or the bleed-through from a distant channel. This was sharp, violent, and close. And then a voice came through, a voice laced with a level of sheer, unadulterated panic that bypassed my ears and went straight to the ice in my veins. "Mayday! Mayday! Somebody, anybody, can you hear me? Help me!" the voice screamed. It was a man, his voice pitched high and strained with a terror so raw it was almost inhuman. It was the sound of a man who was already dead and just didn't know it yet. "My brakes are gone. God, I've lost my brakes. They're gone." My blood ran cold. Every trucker has a hierarchy of fears: a blown tire, a load shift, a jackknife on black ice. But at the very top of that list, the absolute apex of terror, is total brake failure on a steep mountain grade, and brake failure on the tail of the dragon. That wasn't just a nightmare. It was a death sentence. There are no runaway truck ramps, no gentle shoulders, no room for error. There is only the rock wall on one side and a 1,000-foot drop into blackness on the other. My training, my 30 years of experience took over. My own fear was shoved into a box and locked away. "Driver, what's your 20? What's your location? Talk to me. Keep it together." I yelled back into my mic, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the plastic. My voice was calm, steady, the voice I'd used 100 times to talk down panicked rookies and scared four-wheelers. "I'm on the dragon." "Southbound," he yelled back, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. I think I just passed mile marker 3. Oh God, I'm not going to make the next curve. I'm going too fast. Mile marker 3. I had just passed mile marker 4. He was just ahead of me. Less than a mile. I could almost feel his panic, the sickening lurch in his stomach, the terror of being a passenger in a multi-ton runaway missile on this unforgiving, twisting road. I could picture his cab, the frantic pumping of a useless brake, pedal, the white-knuckled grip on the wheel, the blur of trees and rock rushing past his windows. "Hang on, driver." Hang on, I shouted, my mind racing, trying to pull some piece of life-saving advice from the air. Try to gear down. Throw it in the granny gear. Use the mountain if you have to. Scrape the rock wall. It'll tear up your rig, but it's better than the alternative. I was shouting the desperate last-ditch options we all know, the Hail Mary plays of trucking. There was no response for a moment, just the sound of his breathing, a ragged, terrified, hyperventilating sound that filled my cab. Then he spoke again, and all the panic was gone from his voice. It was replaced by a sudden, chilling quiet, a tone of utter final resignation. "It's too late," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The curve." His transmission cut out with a sharp, final burst of static, a sound like a door slamming shut. "Driver? Driver, come back!" I yelled into the radio, my voice cracking. "Talk to me!" What do you see? Silence. A dead, profound, absolute silence that was 1,000 times more terrifying than his screams. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, wild thing. I was pushing my own rig faster now, faster than was safe, my eyes straining, scanning the darkness ahead. I was expecting to see it, the horrific, fiery tableau of a wreck. The orange glow of flames against the trees, the twisted, unrecognizable silhouette of a truck, the sickening smell of burning diesel and rubber. I rounded the next curve, the one he must have been talking about, a nasty left-hander with a sheer drop on the right. My headlights swept across the road, illuminating every inch of the asphalt, the rock face, the guardrail. There was nothing. The road was empty. It was pristine. There was no truck, no accident, no fire, no skid marks on the pavement, no broken guardrail, no shattered glass glittering on the asphalt. Nothing. It was as if he and his truck had simply been erased from existence. "What the hell?" I muttered, my voice a hoarse whisper in the cab. I slowed my truck to a crawl, the engine's rumble sounding unnaturally loud. I scanned the steep wooded embankment to my right, looking for any sign of a vehicle that might have gone over. A broken tree, a path of destruction through the undergrowth. Nothing. The forest was still and undisturbed. It was impossible. I heard him, I talked to him. He was right here, just seconds ahead of me. The clarity of the signal, the raw terror in his voice. It was real. I hadn't imagined it. I pulled my truck over to the narrow shoulder, my tires crunching on the gravel right next to the green sign for mile marker 3. I had to be sure. I had to know. I grabbed my powerful maglite from behind the seat, its heavy metal body a comforting weight in my hand. I got out of the cab, the sudden blast of cold air a shock to my system. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked to the edge of the road, my flashlight beam cutting a sharp white cone through the darkness. I swept the light down the embankment into the deep black ravine, nothing but trees and rocks and shadows. I walked the edge of the road, my light tracing every inch of the guardrail, the asphalt, the rock wall. I was looking for any clue, any sign, any fragment of evidence that would explain what I had just heard. A piece of chrome, a smear of paint, anything. There was nothing. It was as if the event had happened in another dimension, its sound bleeding through into mine, but not its physical reality. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. Was it a prank? Some sick individual with a powerful transmitter playing a cruel joke on a lonely road? It was possible. The CB world had its share of creeps and weirdos, but the terror in that voice, it was too real, too raw. You can't fake that kind of primal fear. And the timing, the location, it was too perfect. Defeated, I was about to turn back to my truck when my light fell on it. It was small, almost completely hidden by overgrown weeds and dead leaves at the base of a large, gnarled oak tree, just a few feet from the mile marker sign. It was a simple, homemade wooden cross, the wood weathered to a soft, silvery gray by years of sun and rain and snow. It was tilted slightly as if the mountain were slowly trying to reclaim it. My heart, which had been pounding with adrenaline, seemed to stop altogether. I took a hesitant step closer, my flashlight beam trembling slightly in my hand. Nailed to the center of the cross was a small rectangular plaque, the kind you get made at a trophy shop. It was laminated, the plastic yellowed and cracked with age, but the words underneath were still legible. I knelt down in the cold, damp dirt. The beam of my mag light focused on the plaque. There was a picture, faded and bleached by the sun, of a smiling man with a thick, dark mustache and kind eyes. His arm was wrapped around a smiling woman, and two young children stood in front of them. It was a picture of a happy family, frozen in a moment of time. Below the picture, an inscription was engraved. My breath caught in my throat as I read the words. In loving memory of James Jimmy Callahan, a loving husband and father who lost his life on this road. October 14th, 2015. He died doing what he loved, but he's forever missed. Keep on truckin', Daddy. October 14th, 2015, my blood turned to ice water. I scrambled back to my feet and looked at the digital clock on my dashboard, its red numbers glowing with a sudden, terrible significance. The date was October 14th. The time was just after midnight. 10 years. 10 years to the day, to the minute. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air washed over me, a deep, internal cold that seemed to emanate from my very bones. I stumbled back to my truck, my mind refusing to connect the dots, refusing to accept the impossible, terrifying truth that was staring me in the face. I got back into the cab and slammed the door, the sound echoing in the profound silence. The cab, which had always been my sanctuary, my fortress, suddenly felt small and vulnerable. I sat there for a long time, staring at the little wooden cross, a tiny forgotten monument to a decade-old tragedy, now illuminated in the ambient glow of my parking lights. James Jimmy Callahan. He had died right here, 10 years ago. His brakes had failed. He hadn't made the curve. I was about to start my engine, desperate to get away from this haunted stretch of road, when the CB crackled one last time. It wasn't a scream this time. It wasn't a voice filled with panic. It was a single soft whisper, a voice filled not with terror, but with a strange, sad, ethereal peace. It was the same man's voice, but all the fear was gone, replaced by a profound sense of release. "Thank you," it said. And then there was only silence. The silence of the radio, the silence of the mountain, the silence of the grave. I didn't answer. Who was I talking to? A ghost? An echo in time? I just put the truck in gear and drove away, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I didn't speed. I drove slowly, carefully, my eyes fixed on the road, my mind a million miles away. I don't know what happened that night. I've read about it since, in forums and old books about paranormal phenomena. Phantom calls, ghost broadcasts. The theory that strong emotional events, especially traumatic ones involving electronic equipment, can imprint themselves on the environment, replaying on their anniversary. Was that what I heard? A 10-year-old echo of a man's last terrified moments, a residual haunting trapped in the airwaves? Or was it something more? Was it a spirit reliving his final moments, reaching out for help, for a witness, for someone to hear him one last time on the anniversary of his death? Did my answering his call, my being there, somehow give him a peace he hadn't been able to find? That final, whispered thank you haunts me more than the screams. It implies a consciousness, a purpose. He wasn't just an echo, he was a soul lost on the road. All I know is that I was that someone. I was the one who answered his last call. And his voice, both the terrified scream that ripped through the silence and the final peaceful whisper that settled it, will be with me forever. They are now a part of my story, a part of the million stories of the road, a permanent ghost on the lonely frequencies of the night.